The storm didn't care who you were, or how long you'd lived. That night the road was a trap. No phone signal, no headlights behind you. A retired SWAT officer heard something most people would have ignored. A sound buried under wind and snow. Stopping meant risking his life. Driving on meant pretending he never heard it. What he found in the storm wasn't just an accident. It was two elderly people with minutes left. And once he stepped into the cold, there was no turning back. The wind came down from the mountains like something alive, dragging snow and darkness with it, swallowing the forest road and every sound that dared exist beyond the storm. Thomas Caldwell had lived through enough winters to know this was the kind that erased people. At 68, Thomas moved more slowly than he once had, but his habits were still precise, almost ceremonial. He stood inside his small log cabin, one hand on the iron latch of the front door, the other bracing his weight against the frame as his left knee protested sharply. The knee had never healed right after a forced entry operation 22 years earlier, when a reinforced door collapsed inward and pinned him beneath it. Doctors called it structural damage. Thomas called it the day his body started keeping score. He was a tall man, still broad through the shoulders despite age thinning his frame. His hair, once jet black, had faded to a rough steel gray, cropped short in the military style he never abandoned. A neatly trimmed beard framed a face cut with hard angles, a jawline that had intimidated suspects long before words were spoken. Deep lines sat permanently between his brows, carved by decades of making decisions where hesitation cost lives. His eyes were pale blue, sharp but tired, the eyes of a man who had seen too many nights end badly and too few end quietly. He reached for the latch, ready to seal the cabin against the storm, when Axel reacted. Axel was already on his feet before Thomas registered the movement. The German Shepherd was nearly 10 years old, well past his operational prime, but age had not dulled his instincts. His coat was a mix of black and tan, thickened by winter, dusted white along his back where snow had blown in through the cracks of the door. A faded scar ran above his right eye, a souvenir from a canine takedown gone sideways years ago. Axel's ears snapped forward, his body stiffening, tail lowering into a controlled, deliberate stillness that Thomas recognized instantly. This was not fear. This was focus. Axel let out a low sound, not quite a growl, not quite a whine, something in between, restrained, deliberate. Thomas's hand froze on the latch. "What is it, boy?" he asked quietly, his voice roughened by the cold air and long disuse. Axel didn't look at him. His eyes were fixed on the door, nose lifting slightly as if testing the air itself. The storm howled louder, wind slamming against the cabin walls, but beneath it, Thomas felt something shift inside him, a pressure, a memory. That sound Axel made. It was the same one he'd used before breaching doors, before tracking suspects through alleys thick with rain and garbage, before moments when the air itself seemed wrong. Thomas closed his eyes briefly, listening past the obvious violence of the storm. That was when he heard it. Faint, almost swallowed by the wind, a metallic sound, distant but unmistakable to someone who had spent a lifetime cataloging danger. Not the crack of ice, not a tree splitting under snow load. This was sharper, hollow, like twisted steel settling after impact. Thomas exhaled slowly, the way he had taught rookies to do when adrenaline threatened to outrun judgment. His first instinct was to dismiss it. Winter played tricks on sound, mountains echoed lies, and he was old now. Alone. No radio, no backup. He looked down at his hands, noting the faint tremor in his fingers. The doctor said it was normal. Nerve damage compounded by cold. Thomas had learned not to trust easy explanations. Axel moved closer to the door, placing his weight there as if he could block or guard it. His breathing was controlled, measured. The dog's dark eyes flicked back toward Thomas for half a second, checking in the way he always had, waiting for a command that might never come. Thomas felt the familiar tightening in his chest, not pain, not yet, but something like pressure, like the body remembering too much at once. Retirement had been forced on him after a mild cardiac event during a training exercise. The department called it a precaution. Thomas heard it as a verdict. Since then, he had come here, to this stretch of land near an old mountain pass where the road bent sharply and disappeared into forest. He told himself he wanted solitude. The truth was quieter and harder. Here, no one expected him to be anything. Another sound cut through the wind, clearer this time. A dull, echoing thud, followed by a long, unnatural silence. Axel's body tensed further, muscles coiling beneath his thick coat. He let out a single sharp bark before stopping himself, as if remembering where he was. Thomas's pulse quickened. He thought of the road, the old pass. He knew its history. In the winter it claimed cars the way rivers claimed stones. He glanced toward the small window beside the door, peering out into a wall of white. Visibility was nearly zero. Any sane man would stay inside. Any doctor would tell him to sit down, keep warm, wait until morning. Thomas turned away from the latch. His knee screamed in protest as he reached for his heavy coat, fingers stiff as he shoved his arms through the sleeves. He grabbed the flashlight from the hook by the door, its metal cold and familiar in his palm. Axel was already waiting, tail low, posture alert. "Easy," Thomas murmured, more to himself than the dog. He paused, one hand resting on the doorframe, feeling the vibration of the wind through the wood. This was the moment he knew well, the quiet line between action and regret. Years ago, crossing it had been simple. You moved because people depended on you. Now, there was no one to call it in, no one to write a report, just a sound in the storm, and a dog who still believed his partner would follow him anywhere. Thomas opened the door. The wind hit him like a physical force, tearing heat from his body in seconds. Snow whipped across his face, stinging his eyes. He stepped onto the porch, boots sinking immediately into drifts that hadn't been there an hour earlier. Axel moved ahead without hesitation, nose low, navigating by instinct alone. Thomas followed, heart pounding harder now, every step a negotiation with pain and doubt. Somewhere beyond the trees, something had happened, and whether he liked it or not, the night had just pulled him back into its grip. The old mountain pass revealed itself only in fragments, glimpses torn from the storm, like memories half forgotten. Thomas followed Axel into the white void, boots sinking unevenly with every step as the ground sloped upward. The wind was relentless here, funneled tightly between pine-covered ridges, turning the snowfall into a horizontal assault. Visibility dropped to less than 10 feet. The world had narrowed to the dull glow of Thomas's flashlight, the dark shape of Axel moving ahead, and the sharp, aching awareness of his own body struggling to keep up. Axel moved with deliberate confidence, head low, nose working beneath the snow, paws placing themselves where instinct told him the ground would hold. Despite his age, the German shepherd's frame was still powerful, his shoulders rolling smoothly beneath his thick winter coat. Frost clung to his whiskers, and his breath came out in steady clouds, controlled, disciplined. Thomas recognized that rhythm. Axel was tracking, not following a trail so much as reading the absence of one, subtle disturbances in snow, shifts in scent carried by chaotic wind. Thomas, by contrast, moved cautiously, each step negotiated with his damaged knee. The joint sent sharp flashes of pain up his leg when he put weight on it wrong, a reminder of years spent kicking indoors and trusting momentum more than anatomy. He adjusted his gait, compensating, knowing the price he would pay for it later. The pass itself curved sharply ahead, though Thomas could barely make out its shape beneath the snow. He knew it by memory. He had driven this stretch countless times when he first moved up here, before the winters grew heavier, and the road crews stopped pretending they could keep it safe. Locals called it Dead Man's Bend, half as a joke, half as a warning. The mountain had claimed trucks, sedans, even a tour bus once, years back. Thomas had responded to that crash too, back when he still wore the badge. The memory surfaced uninvited. twisted metal, screaming wind, the smell of antifreeze and fear. He pushed it down, focusing instead on the present. Axel slowed suddenly, tail stiffening. Thomas nearly collided with him before stopping short. "What do you have?" he muttered, raising the flashlight. The beam cut through the snow just enough to reveal the faint edge of asphalt, slick and black beneath a thin layer of ice. Tire tracks, fresh ones, skewed wildly toward the outside of the curve before disappearing entirely under a drift. Thomas's chest tightened. Someone had lost control here. Recently. He crouched slightly, ignoring the protest from his knee, and ran a gloved hand over the snow. It was still loose, not yet hardened by wind. Minutes, maybe an hour at most. Axel moved again, this time angling off the road, pulling Thomas toward the tree line. The ground dropped away more sharply there. Thomas felt the shift immediately, the way the earth slanted unnaturally beneath the snow. He planted his boot hard, catching himself before sliding. His heart hammered now, not just from exertion, but from the growing certainty that his instincts had been right. As they descended, the wind seemed to change pitch, bouncing differently off unseen shapes below. Then, the flashlight beam caught something that did not belong to the forest. A jagged reflection, dull and metallic. Thomas moved faster despite himself, breath burning in his lungs. The shape resolved into the side of a vehicle, partially buried, its roof crushed inward where it had rolled. Snow had already begun to claim it, piling up along the windows, filling the gaps where glass had shattered. "Jesus," Thomas breathed. Axel let out a short, urgent bark and circled the wreck, claws scraping faintly against frozen metal. Thomas approached carefully, scanning the area the way training demanded, even though the idea of danger here felt abstract. The real enemy was the cold. He shone the light into the front seat first, empty. The airbags had deployed, hanging like deflated ghosts. He moved toward the back, heart sinking when he heard it. A sound so faint it almost disappeared beneath the storm. A breath. Then another. Thomas leaned closer, angling the flashlight through a shattered rear window. Inside were two figures. An elderly man slumped sideways, his face pale beneath a cap pulled low, gray stubble visible along his jaw. His body was large but frail-looking, shoulders hunched inward as if he were trying to fold himself smaller against the cold. One leg was pinned awkwardly beneath the dashboard, the angle wrong in a way that made Thomas's stomach tighten. Beside him was a woman, still upright, her hands clenched tightly in her lap as if holding herself together by sheer force. She was thin, with sharp cheekbones and a narrow face flushed red from cold and fear. Her hair, once dark brown, was streaked heavily with gray and pulled back into a loose, practical knot that had come undone during the crash, strands whipping across her face. Her eyes were wide and alert, a clear hazel that reflected the flashlight beam as it swept over her. She turned her head toward Thomas, and relief and terror collided in her expression. "Oh, thank God," she said, her voice trembling but strong. I thought no one was coming." Thomas exhaled slowly, grounding himself. "I'm here," he said, keeping his tone even, authoritative. "You're not alone." The man groaned softly, his eyelids fluttering but not opening. The woman reached for him instinctively, her gloved hand brushing his arm. "This is my husband," she said quickly. "His name is Harold. He's diabetic. He hit the wheel hard when we slid." Thomas nodded, already assessing. Harold was heavy-set, his coat stretched tight across his chest, his breathing shallow and uneven. His skin had the waxy look Thomas recognized too well, early hypothermia compounded by shock. "I'm Thomas," he said. "This is Axel." Axel moved closer, placing his front paws on the edge of the back seat, peering in with focused concern. The woman looked at the dog, some of the tension easing from her shoulders. "He's beautiful," she whispered, reaching out shakily. Axel allowed the contact, pressing closer to the warmth inside the car. "What's your name, ma'am?" Thomas asked. "Eleanor," she replied. "Eleanor Finch." Her posture was rigid, but there was a quiet resilience in the way she held herself, spine straight despite the circumstances. This was a woman who had endured things, Thomas could tell, likely years of caretaking, of putting herself second. Eleanor's eyes flicked back to the road above, panic resurfacing. Our phone. There's no signal. We tried. We've been here. I don't know how long. Thomas checked his watch out of habit, then stopped himself. Time was less important than condition now. We need to get you out of here, he said, but not all at once. Harold's leg is trapped. I need to stabilize him before we move him. Eleanor nodded immediately, swallowing hard. Tell me what to do. Thomas felt a familiar, steady focus settle over him. The doubt, the pain, the storm, all of it receded slightly as training took over. He glanced back toward the road, then at the darkening sky beyond the trees. The storm showed no sign of letting up. If anything, it was intensifying. Axel shifted suddenly, ears flicking back toward the slope they'd come down. He let out a low warning sound. Thomas followed his gaze, scanning the darkness. The mountain groaned faintly beneath the wind, snow shifting in unseen places. Thomas knew then, with cold clarity, that getting these two people out would not be simple, and staying here much longer would not be an option. The cold inside the vehicle was different from the cold outside. It was heavier, stagnant, clinging to skin and breath as if time itself had slowed within the crushed metal shell. Thomas leaned partially through the broken rear window, his shoulders scraping ice-coated glass, flashlight clenched between his teeth to keep both hands free. Snow hissed against the car's exterior, slowly sealing every opening the storm could find. All right, he said calmly, forcing his voice into the steady cadence he'd used 1,000 times before. We're going to take this one step at a time. Eleanor nodded quickly, though her hands trembled in her lap. Up close, Thomas could see the toll the cold had already taken on her. Her lips were tinged faintly blue, her breath shallow but controlled. The lines around her eyes deepened when she frowned, not from panic, but from effort. Eleanor Finch was the kind of woman who held herself together because she had always been expected to. She wore a long wool coat, dark green and well-maintained despite its age, the collar turned up against the cold. Her gloves were mismatched, one leather, one knit, suggesting she'd grabbed whatever she could before leaving the house. Tell me what you need, she said. I can do it. Thomas gave her a brief nod of approval. People like her were easier to work with under pressure. He shifted his attention to Harold. Harold Finch was barely conscious now, his head lolling slightly with each uneven breath. His face was pale beneath the frost forming in his eyebrows, the skin stretched tight across his cheeks. The man had once been strong. Thomas could tell by the breadth of his shoulders and the thick bones of his hands. Age and illness had softened him, but not erased him. The problem was his leg. The dashboard had collapsed inward during the crash, trapping Harold's right leg at an unnatural angle. Thomas reached in carefully, probing around the injury without moving it, checking for bleeding. "Harold," he said loudly, close to the man's ear. "Harold, can you hear me?" A faint groan answered him, followed by a shallow gasp. "Stay with me," Thomas said. "You're doing fine." Axel stood with his front paws braced against the doorframe, his body half inside the vehicle now. His dark eyes were locked on Harold, ears angled forward, alert to every sound. Without prompting, Axel pressed closer, his broad chest radiating heat. Eleanor noticed and exhaled shakily. "He's warm," she murmured almost to herself. Thomas reached back and shrugged off his heavy coat, folding it tightly before draping it over Harold's torso. "I'm going to need you to keep him talking," he told Eleanor. "Ask him questions, anything familiar." Eleanor swallowed, then leaned toward her husband. "Harold," she said softly, "do you remember the yellow house on Cedar Street, the one with the crooked porch?" Harold's eyelids fluttered again. Thomas nodded, satisfied. He pulled a compact emergency kit from his pack, an old one, restocked piece by piece over the years. He worked methodically, fingers numb but precise, securing a temporary brace around Harold's leg to prevent further movement. Each motion sent a fresh wave of pain through his own knee as he shifted his weight, but he ignored it. Pain was noise. Focus was survival. The wind shifted suddenly, rattling the car violently. Snow poured through the broken window, coating Thomas's sleeves. He cursed under his breath and adjusted his position. They were losing the race against the elements. He checked Harold's pulse again, weak but steady. Hypothermia was advancing faster than shock now. "We can't leave him here," Eleanor said, fear cracking her voice. Thomas met her gaze. "I know." He didn't add the rest. That moving Harold too soon could kill him. That staying too long could do the same. This was the space between bad options where people usually panicked. Thomas didn't. He scanned the area, mind already running through contingencies. His cabin was less than half a mile away, but in this storm, distance meant nothing. He glanced back up toward the road. The curve above them was completely lost to white. No headlights, no sound of engines. "Listen to me," Thomas said, lowering his voice. "We're not going to try to get the car out. The priority is keeping him alive until we can move him safely." Eleanor nodded, gripping Harold's hand tighter. Axel shifted suddenly, letting out a sharp yelp before pulling back. Thomas spun, heart jumping. "Axel!" The dog limped slightly, favoring his left hind leg. Thomas shone the flashlight downward and saw a thin line of blood where the dog had scraped himself against a jagged piece of ice hidden beneath the snow. Not deep, but enough. "Damn it," Thomas muttered. He crouched awkwardly, ignoring the jolt of pain in his knee, and checked the injury quickly. Axel stood still, ears pinned back but eyes calm, trusting. "You're all right," Thomas told him. He wrapped the paw as best he could with a strip of cloth. The moment lingered. Dog, man, storm, each depending on the other in quiet ways. Eleanor watched, something like hope flickering across her face. The mountain groaned again, deeper this time. A low rumble traveled through the ground beneath their feet, subtle but unmistakable. Thomas froze. He knew that sound. Snow shifting, weight redistributing. "We don't have long," he said sharply. Eleanor's eyes widened. "What does that mean?" "It means we're moving soon," Thomas replied. One way or another. He repositioned himself, bracing his shoulder against the doorframe, testing the dashboard's give. It didn't move. The metal screamed in protest, unmoved. Thomas exhaled through his nose, calculating. For the first time since stepping into the storm, doubt edged in. His body was slower, his heart weaker. Axel injured, and 2 lives depended on him making the right call. He looked at Eleanor, at Harold, at Axel. The answer came with brutal clarity. They could not get Harold free here. Not safely. "We're going to stabilize him as best we can," Thomas said. "Then we're getting you out of this car." Eleanor stared at him. And Harold. Thomas didn't look away. "We bring him with us," he said, "but not tonight." The words settled heavily between them, carried away almost immediately by the wind. The storm was not done with them yet. The decision, once made, allowed no hesitation. Thomas moved with urgency now, every action deliberate, stripped of anything unnecessary. The storm roared around them, wind clawing at the wrecked car as if the mountain itself were trying to finish what gravity had started. Snow continued to pour in through the shattered windows, undoing every small gain of warmth they managed to create. "Eleanor," Thomas said firmly, meeting her eyes, "I need you to stay with me. We're going to move him together." Eleanor nodded, jaw set, fear pressed down beneath resolve. Up close, Thomas noticed how thin she really was, her frame slight beneath the heavy coat, shoulders narrow but squared with determination. Her hands were red and raw from cold but steady. This was not the first time she'd been forced to be strong when circumstances demanded it. Thomas repositioned himself, bracing one foot against the car's frame despite the sharp pain that flared instantly through his knee. He ignored it, focusing instead on leverage and angles. "On my count," he said, "we lift just enough to free his leg, no more." Eleanor swallowed and tightened her grip on Harold's coat. Axel stood close, limping slightly but alert, ears flicking constantly toward the trees as if tracking the storm's moods. Thomas counted softly. 1, 2, 3. Metal screamed as Thomas forced the dashboard upward with his shoulder, muscles burning as pain radiated through his chest and leg. Eleanor pulled gently, carefully, freeing Harold's trapped leg inch by inch. Harold cried out weakly, his body tensing before sagging again. Thomas held the pressure, vision narrowing as the strain tested limits he hadn't pushed in years. Finally, Eleanor gave a sharp nod. "It's free." Thomas released the dashboard, stumbling back as it slammed into place. He sucked in air, steadying himself before the world tilted too far. There was no time to rest. Working together, they maneuvered Harold carefully out of the car, Thomas supporting most of the man's weight, while Eleanor stabilized his head and shoulders. Harold was heavier than he looked, dead weight pulling Thomas downward as the snow swallowed their feet. His knee nearly gave out twice, but Thomas locked it rigid through sheer will. Axel moved ahead, carving a path, stopping frequently to check back on them. His injured paw left faint red marks in the snow that vanished almost instantly beneath fresh flakes. They had made it only a short distance from the wreck when the wind shifted violently, knocking Thomas off balance. He went down hard on one knee, a flash of white pain exploding through him. Eleanor nearly fell with him, but Axel lunged forward, planting himself, giving Thomas the split second he needed to recover. "I'm okay," Thomas lied, forcing himself upright. The cabin was invisible somewhere ahead, swallowed by trees and storm. Distance had become an abstract concept, measured only in breath and pain. Each step felt heavier than the last, as if the mountain itself were leaning against them. Eleanor's breathing grew ragged, fear creeping back into her eyes. "We're not going to make it like this," she said, voice shaking. Thomas looked at her, at Harold slumped against him, at Axel trembling but still standing guard. "We are," he said quietly, "because we don't have another option." They pressed on. Time stretched thin and meaningless. Thomas's chest tightened again, not sharp pain yet, but a warning pulse he recognized too well. He adjusted his breathing, slowing it deliberately, keeping panic at bay. He could not afford weakness now. Axel suddenly stopped, ears snapping forward. A low growl rolled from his chest. Thomas followed his gaze and saw it, the faint outline of his cabin, barely visible through the storm, lights long dead, roof nearly indistinguishable from the surrounding snow. Relief surged through him, quickly replaced by fresh urgency. The porch steps were buried, the door half iced over. Thomas fumbled with the latch, fingers numb, cursing when it stuck. Eleanor shifted Harold's weight with surprising strength while Thomas forced the door open. Warm air, what little remained, spilled out into the storm. Inside, the cabin was dark and silent, a fragile shelter against the violence outside. They dragged Harold in, collapsing onto the floor in a heap of exhausted limbs and breathless gasps. Thomas slammed the door shut behind them, sliding the deadbolt home with shaking hands. The sudden quiet was almost deafening. Eleanor leaned against the wall, tears freezing on her lashes as the adrenaline drained from her body. Axel limped inside last, turning once to face the door before settling heavily near Harold's side, vigilant even now. Thomas stood there for a long moment, chest heaving, every joint screaming, before finally lowering himself to the floor. They were inside. But the storm had followed them in its own way, settling into the walls, the silence heavy with uncertainty. Thomas knew with grim certainty that this night was far from over. The cabin did not warm quickly. Heat moved slowly through old wood and colder memories, creeping outward from the iron stove like something cautious, unsure it was welcome. Thomas fed the fire with stiff, deliberate movements, every bend of his back and knee paid for in sharp, insistent pain. The storm battered the walls relentlessly, wind finding new ways to slip through cracks he had sealed years ago and cracks he had never noticed until now. Eleanor sat on the floor beside Harold, her coat spread beneath him like a makeshift mattress. Up close, in the weak amber light of the lantern, Thomas could see exhaustion settling into her bones. Her face had lost its flushed color, skin pale and drawn tight across high cheekbones. Strands of gray-streaked brown hair clung damply to her temples, having come loose entirely from its knot. Yet her posture remained upright, spine straight despite the circumstances, hands firm as she rubbed Harold's arms in slow, steady motions. This was not panic. This was endurance. Harold drifted in and out of consciousness, his breathing shallow but more regular than it had been in the car. The brace Thomas had fashioned held his injured leg in place, though any movement still sent a shudder through his body. Sweat beaded along his forehead despite the cold, a dangerous sign Thomas did not miss. Hypothermia and shock made for unpredictable partners. Axel lay close, pressed against Harold's side, his broad chest rising and falling steadily. The dog's injured paw was tucked beneath him, protected, though a faint tremor ran through his body from time to time. His eyes remained open, alert, tracking every sound from outside. Thomas finished stoking the fire and leaned heavily against the table, catching his breath. The familiar pressure returned to his chest, heavier now, tightening in a way that made him pause. He closed his eyes briefly, counting breaths the way his cardiologist had taught him. Slow in, slower out. The pain receded just enough to be ignored. He pushed himself upright again. "We're staying," Thomas said quietly, more statement than decision. Eleanor looked up at him. "We can't go back out there," she agreed, though fear flickered in her eyes. "Not like this." Thomas nodded. He had known that the moment he opened the cabin door. Outside, the storm showed no sign of easing. If anything, it sounded angrier now, as if offended by their refusal to be claimed. He moved to the radio mounted on the wall, an old emergency unit he had kept serviced out of habit more than hope. He turned the dial slowly, listening to static swallow every frequency. Nothing. He tried again. Still nothing. Eleanor watched him, her hands never leaving Harold. "No signal?" she asked. Thomas shook his head. "Not tonight." The words settled heavily between them. Night in the mountains was not measured in hours. It was measured in body temperature, in heart rate, in whether or not someone made it to morning. Thomas gathered what supplies he had: a small first aid kit, a handful of energy bars, 2 wool blankets worn thin with age. It was not enough for 4 bodies, especially not injured ones. He did the math quickly, instinctively. Calories, heat, time. "I'm going to need you to stay awake," he told Eleanor, "both of us. If he starts shivering hard or stops responding, you tell me immediately." Eleanor nodded, jaw tightening. "I won't sleep." Thomas believed her. He moved to Axel, kneeling with a soft grunt as pain flared again. He checked the bandage on the dog's paw, tightening it slightly when Axel shifted. "You're doing good," Thomas murmured. Axel's tail thumped weakly once against the floor. The cabin creaked suddenly, a loud crack echoing from the roof as wind-driven snow piled higher. Eleanor flinched, her composure slipping for just a second. "Is it safe?" she asked. Thomas listened, eyes on the ceiling, cataloging sounds the way he always had. "It'll hold," he said after a moment. He did not add that everything had a breaking point. Hours passed in fragments. Thomas moved constantly, checking Harold's pulse, adjusting the fire, reinforcing the door with a heavy chair. His movements grew slower, his breathing more labored. The warning signs were there, impossible to ignore now. He pressed a hand to his chest when the pain sharpened, just briefly, when he thought Eleanor wasn't looking. She noticed anyway. "You're hurt," she said softly. Thomas met her gaze. There was no fear in it now, only concern. "I've been worse," he replied. It was only half a lie. A sudden sound from Harold cut through the quiet. A sharp gasp, followed by a weak cough. Eleanor leaned in immediately. "Harold?" His eyes opened, unfocused, darting wildly before settling on her face. "Cold," he whispered. Thomas moved in, checking him quickly. His temperature was still low, but the fact that he was responding was a good sign. "You're safe," Eleanor said, voice breaking despite her efforts. "You're inside." Outside, the wind screamed louder, a sustained howl that rattled the windows violently. Thomas felt the cabin shudder. His heart thudded painfully in his chest. He made his decision then, fully and without reservation. Even if the storm broke, even if he managed to reach help at first light, he was not leaving these people alone tonight, not for any reason. He sank back against the wall, exhaustion pulling at him harder now than pain ever had. Axel shifted, placing his head on Thomas's boot, grounding him. Thomas rested a hand on the dog's thick fur, feeling the steady warmth there. "We stay," he said again, quietly, to the room, to himself, to the storm beyond the walls. The night stretched on, heavy and unyielding, and none of them knew yet what the morning would demand. Morning did not arrive gently. It crept in through the cabin's narrow windows as a dull gray suggestion, the storm's violence finally exhausted into a low, persistent wind. Thomas was already awake. He had not truly slept at all. He sat on the floor with his back against the wall, legs stretched out stiffly in front of him. The weight of the night settled deep in his bones. Axel lay pressed against his boot, breathing slow and steady, eyes half-lidded but alert. Across the room, Eleanor knelt beside Harold, her movements smaller now, careful, conserving energy the way Thomas recognized from long operations that ran too long. Harold's breathing had stabilized through the night, shallow but consistent. His skin remained pale, but the dangerous blue tinge had receded slightly. It was not recovery. It was survival, temporary, fragile. Thomas checked his watch. The storm had blown itself out just enough to allow a window of opportunity. If there was one chance to be seen, to be heard, this was it. He pushed himself upright slowly, pausing as his chest tightened again, sharper this time. He waited it out, jaw clenched, refusing to let the pain dictate the morning. "I'm going outside," he said quietly. Eleanor looked up immediately. "Alone?" Thomas nodded. "I won't be long." She studied him for a moment, then nodded once. "Be careful," she said. There was no drama in her voice, just fact. Thomas grabbed his coat, pulling it on with stiff arms, and reached for the old emergency signal unit stored near the door. It was a relic from his SWAT days, an emergency beacon designed for mountain extractions, battered but functional. He had kept it serviced out of habit, a quiet acknowledgement that the mountains did not care how experienced you were. He opened the door and stepped back into the cold. The wind cut immediately, sharper now without the full fury of the storm behind it. Snow lay piled high against the cabin, reshaped overnight into unfamiliar drifts and ridges. The world was quieter, but not forgiving. Thomas trudged a short distance away from the cabin, choosing a small clearing where the trees thinned just enough to give him a sliver of sky. Each step sent pain flaring through his knee and chest alike, a reminder that his body had given him all it had to give. He planted the beacon firmly, adjusting its angle, fingers clumsy with cold. Axel followed him outside despite the injury, limping slightly but determined. "Stay," Thomas said gently, and Axel obeyed, sitting nearby, eyes fixed on his partner. Thomas activated the beacon. A low electronic hum answered, followed by a faint blinking light that cut weakly through the gray air. He stared upward, searching the sky for any sign, movement, sound, anything. Nothing. Minutes passed. The wind tugged at his coat. His breath came harder now, chest tightening with each inhale. He leaned heavily on his knee, vision narrowing. Doubt crept in, insidious and quiet. He had stayed. He had done everything right, and still, it might not be enough. The pain spiked suddenly, sharp and undeniable, dropping him to one knee in the snow. He stayed there, head bowed, one hand pressed hard against his chest. Axel rose instantly, whining softly, moving closer until his warm body was pressed against Thomas's side. "Easy," Thomas whispered, more to himself than the dog. He forced himself upright again, every movement deliberate. He would not collapse here. Not yet. A distant sound cut through the air then. So faint at first he thought it imagined. Thomas lifted his head, straining to listen past the wind. There it was again. A low, rhythmic thrum, uneven but growing louder. Engines. He felt a surge of adrenaline that nearly knocked him off balance. He waved his flashlight, arm trembling with effort, angling the beam upward. The sound intensified, resolving into the unmistakable chop of helicopter blades fighting thin mountain air. The aircraft emerged from the cloud cover like a ghost, dark and solid and impossibly real. Thomas's breath hitched. He activated the beacon's flare function, a sharp burst of red cutting through the gray. The helicopter banked, adjusting course. Inside the cabin, Eleanor heard the sound and scrambled to the door, heart pounding. She burst outside just in time to see the aircraft circle overhead. Tears streaked down her face, freezing instantly on her cheeks. "They see us," she whispered. Thomas turned toward her, relief and exhaustion colliding so hard, his knees nearly gave out again. He nodded once, unable to speak. The helicopter hovered briefly, then pulled away, likely searching for a safer landing zone. Thomas knew what that meant. This was not the end yet, but it was the beginning of one. He shut down the beacon and leaned heavily against the cabin wall, chest heaving. Axel pressed close, tail thumping weakly against the snow. Eleanor moved to Thomas's side without hesitation, steadying him. "You did it," she said softly. Thomas shook his head faintly. "We did." Inside, Harold stirred, murmuring faintly as the distant sound of the helicopter echoed again, closer now. The morning light brightened incrementally, the mountain reluctantly revealing what it had tried to hide all night. Thomas closed his eyes for a brief moment, allowing himself that small mercy. Help was coming. Not fast, not easily, but it was coming. The rescue did not happen all at once. It never did. It arrived in stages, measured and cautious, the way professionals moved when the mountain still held grudges. The helicopter returned first, circling lower this time, its presence no longer uncertain. Snow churned violently beneath the blades as it hovered, searching for stability. Thomas stood just outside the cabin, one arm braced against the wall, Axel pressed firmly against his leg. The wind tugged at them both, but it no longer felt like an enemy. It felt tired. Moments later, the sound of engines reached them from below. Snowmobiles emerged from the tree line, dark shapes cutting through white, their headlights piercing the thinning storm. Two rescue medics dismounted quickly, their movements efficient and calm. They took in the scene at a glance, the cabin, the injured dog, the man leaning too heavily on his own weight. "Sir, are you hurt?" one of them asked, a tall man with a weathered face and frost lining his beard. Thomas shook his head reflexively, then stopped himself. "Chest pain," he admitted, "on and off." The medic nodded, already moving closer. Inside the cabin, Eleanor sat beside Harold, her hands still resting on his arm as if letting go might undo everything. She looked up when the rescuers entered, relief finally breaking through the composure she had held all night. Harold was transferred carefully, immobilized and wrapped in thermal blankets, his breathing steadier now, his color slowly returning. Eleanor followed close behind, refusing assistance until Harold was secure. Outside, Axel was examined next. The dog tolerated it with quiet dignity, ears flicking but body still. "Tough old guy," one of the medics murmured as he wrapped Axel's paw properly. Thomas watched, a weight lifting he hadn't realized he was carrying. The evacuation took time. Harold and Eleanor were loaded first, bound for the nearest mountain hospital. Thomas insisted Axel go with them. Only when the dog was settled did Thomas allow himself to be checked fully. His heart rhythm was irregular but stable. Enough, the medic said, to justify observation, not panic. As the snowmobiles pulled away, Thomas stood alone for a moment outside the cabin. The storm had finally broken. The sky was pale and open, the mountains revealed again in sharp, indifferent beauty. The night had taken its toll, but it had not taken everything. Hours later, Thomas sat in a hospital room that smelled faintly of antiseptic and clean linen. Axel lay on a blanket beside the bed, asleep for the first time since the storm began. His chest rose and fell in slow, even rhythm. Thomas watched him, fingers absently tracing the scar above the dog's eye. Eleanor returned just before noon. She looked different now, still tired, but lighter somehow. Her coat was gone, replaced by a borrowed sweater that hung loosely on her thin frame. Her hair had been brushed back, revealing a face marked by years, but softened by relief. "Harold's stable," she said quietly. "They say he's going to make it." Thomas nodded once, the corners of his mouth lifting just slightly. "Good." Eleanor hesitated, then sat in the chair beside him. "You saved us," she said. Thomas shook his head slowly. "No," he replied. "We stayed." She considered that, then smiled faintly. "Then thank you for staying." The days that followed passed without drama. Harold recovered slowly, stubbornly, the way men who had lived long lives often did. Eleanor visited Thomas and Axel daily until discharge. When the time came for Thomas to return to his cabin, arrangements had already been made. The local community, alerted by the rescue teams, saw to repairs, supplies, and a reliable emergency signal. Thomas accepted it all without comment. Back at the cabin, life settled into a new rhythm. Axel's movements were slower now, his paw healing but his age undeniable. Thomas's doctor insisted on changes, medication, monitoring, limits. Thomas listened this time. On clear mornings, he and Axel sat on the porch, watching the mountains without needing to challenge them. Winter would come again, he knew that, but the silence no longer felt empty. It felt earned. And on the wall by the door, Thomas left the latch unlocked just a little longer each night. Sometimes the most important choices in life are not about being strong or fast or heroic. They are about staying when it would be easier to leave, about noticing when others pass by without looking, about offering warmth when the world feels cold and indifferent. In our everyday lives, we may never face a blizzard or a life or death rescue, but we are all given moments where someone needs patience, presence, or quiet courage. Those moments shape who we become. If this story made you think of a time you chose to stay, or a time you wish someone had stayed for you, share that thought in the comments below. Your perspective might mean more to someone than you realize. If stories like this still matter to you, consider subscribing. There are more waiting for you here. Thank you so much for watching.